The siren blared through the fire station at 3 a.m. Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the Portland Fire Department, was already putting on her boots before the second siren even sounded. At 42, she had responded to thousands of calls, but something about that cold October morning made her stomach churn in a different way. The call was for a house fire on Maple Street, a quiet neighborhood where Victorian houses lined up like colorful sentinels. As the truck turned the corner, Sarah saw flames licking the second floor of a blue house with white trim. Black smoke spiraled thickly against the still dark sky. The captain quickly divided the teams. Sarah and her partner, Jake, were ordered to check if anyone was trapped inside. They entered through the side door, their flashlights cutting through the thick smoke. The heat was stifling even with full protective gear. On the ground floor, they found an unconscious man in the living room. Jake carried him outside, while Sarah went upstairs. Her years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and something was pulling her toward the second floor. The smoke was thicker there, burning her eyes even through her mask. She checked the first room, then the second. Empty. But when she got to the third room, at the end of the hall, she found the door locked. Sarah kicked the door once, twice, 3 times until the wood gave way. Inside, huddled in the far corner of the closet, was a girl of about 9 years old. The child was conscious, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah reached out her hand, but the girl cowered even further. It was then that Sarah noticed something strange. The girl wasn't just frightened by the fire. She was clutching something to her chest, protecting it. Sarah leaned closer and saw that it was a piece of paper. With gentle movements, Sarah removed her mask for a brief second to show her face to the child. She smiled, trying to convey reassurance. The girl hesitated, then held out the folded paper. Sarah took it and quickly stuffed it into her jacket pocket before putting her mask back on. There was no time to read. The beams above them were beginning to groan dangerously. Sarah grabbed the baby girl in her arms and ran down the hallway, already engulfed in flames. She descended the stairs in seconds that felt like hours. When they finally stepped out into the cool night air, paramedics rushed to receive the child. Sarah reluctantly handed her over, watching as they placed her on a stretcher and checked her vital signs. The man Jake had rescued was being treated in the back of an ambulance. He was conscious now, calling out his daughter Emily's name. Sarah watched the scene with keen attention. There was something wrong with the way the man moved, the way his eyes scanned the area. It wasn't just paternal concern. It was something more calculated, colder. It was only when she returned to the truck, long after the fire had been brought under control and the family had been taken to the hospital, that Sarah remembered the note. She pulled it from her pocket with trembling hands. The handwriting was childlike, the letters uneven and some backwards, but the message was clear enough to make Sarah's heart stop. He started the fire. He hurts, Mommy. Please help. Sarah sat in the back of the truck, clutching the piece of paper as if it were glass. 15 years in the fire department had taught her to deal with tragedies, with deaths, with, incalculable losses. But this was different. This was a child pleading for help in the only way she knew how. She was supposed to hand the paper over to the police immediately. It was protocol. But something made her hesitate. Sarah had grown up in a home where protocol often failed, where the authorities arrived too late, or didn't take concerns seriously. Her own mother had filed countless complaints before they finally managed to escape her abusive father. The next day, Sarah couldn't get Emily out of her mind. During her shift, she made a few discreet calls. A friend in the police force told her that Robert Chen, Emily's father, had no criminal record. Her mother, Linda Chen, had been taken to the hospital with second-degree burns and smoke inhalation. Emily was under observation, but physically fine. Sarah knew she should leave the case in the hands of the authorities, but she also knew, from painful experience, that a piece of paper written by a frightened child could easily be dismissed as fantasy, especially when there was no physical evidence of abuse, and the father seemed respectable. She decided to visit the hospital. It was during her time off, and she was wearing civilian clothes. She found Linda Chen in a room on the 3rd floor. The woman was sitting on the bed, bandaged and pale, but it was her eyes that disturbed Sarah the most. They were eyes she knew very well, eyes that had learned to hide their fear. Sarah introduced herself as the firefighter who had rescued Emily. Linda thanked her profusely, her hands trembling as she gripped Sarah's. They talked about the fire, about how grateful Linda was that her daughter was alive. But Sarah observed, paying attention to details that others might miss. The way Linda kept glancing at the door, how she flinched when footsteps sounded in the hallway, the small contradictions in her story about how the fire started. Sarah didn't mention the role, not yet. Instead, she casually asked if she could visit Emily. Linda hesitated, then agreed, giving the room number where the girl was staying. Sarah noticed the relief in Linda's eyes when she mentioned that Robert had gone home to shower and get clean clothes. Emily was awake when Sarah entered her room. The girl recognized her immediately. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with something akin to hope. Sarah pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat silently for a moment. She then took the paper from her pocket and gently placed it on the bed. Between them, Emily looked at it, then at Sarah, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. Sarah didn't need to force the child to speak. Instead, she simply held her hand and said she was there to listen when Emily was ready. The story unfolded gradually, in broken fragments. The father who was charming in public, but cruel at home. The mother who tried to protect her, but ended up suffering the worst of the abuse. The nights when Emily pretended to sleep while listening to screams coming from her parents' room. The night of the fire, when she had seen her father spill something that smelled strange on the stairs before lighting a match. Sarah listened to everything, her anger growing but her face remaining calm and reassuring. When Emily finished, exhausted from crying, Sarah promised she would do something. She didn't know exactly what, but she would. The problem was that she needed proof. The word of a 9-year-old child against an adult man with no criminal record wouldn't be enough. Sarah knew this. She also knew that the system was broken in ways most people didn't understand. She returned to the fire station and began reviewing the fire reports. Something didn't add up. The fire had started downstairs, but the intensity on the second floor suggested multiple ignition points. Sarah had seen enough arson fires to recognize the patterns. She took her concerns to the fire investigator, a serious man named Marcus Webb. Marcus listened to her observations with increasing attention. He admitted there was something suspicious about the burning pattern, but without concrete evidence of an accelerant or witnesses, it would be difficult to prove arson. Sarah didn't mention Emily's role immediately. Instead, he suggested Marcus take a closer look at Robert Chen's purchase records from the days leading up to the fire. It took 3 days, but Marcus found something. Robert had bought an unusual amount of kerosene at a hardware store 2 weeks before the fire, claiming it was for a heater. But the Chen's house had gas central heating. It was flimsy evidence, but it was a start. Sarah knew she needed more. She began discreetly chatting with neighbors, asking casual questions about the Chen family. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Several neighbors had heard loud arguments coming from the house. One woman mentioned seeing Linda with a black eye a few months ago, although Linda had said she had fallen. Another neighbor noticed that Emily seemed increasingly withdrawn and frightened. These were circumstantial pieces of evidence, but together, they began to paint a picture. Sarah compiled everything and took it to her friend in the police force, Detective James Morrison. This time, she also showed him the note Emily had given her. James stared at the note for a long time before looking up at Sarah. He was a good police officer, one of the rare ones who truly cared. He admitted it was a difficult case, but promised to investigate. Sarah insisted that any investigation should be conducted with extreme care to protect Linda and Emily. James agreed. In the following days, Sarah visited Emily in the hospital whenever she could. She brought coloring books, puzzles, anything to distract the girl, but mostly, she was there as a constant and safe presence. Emily began to open up more, talking about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, about her favorite teacher at school, about small, normal things that children should be able to think about without fear. Linda also began to trust Sarah. During one visit, when they were alone, Linda finally admitted the truth. She had been with Robert for 12 years, and the violence had started soon after their marriage. She had tried to leave several times, but Robert always found her, always convincing her to return with promises and threats in equal measure. She was afraid of what he would do to Emily if she tried to leave again. Sarah understood. She had seen her own mother go through the same cycle. She held Linda's hands and promised that this time would be different. She knew people. She knew resources. She had connections. She would help Linda and Emily escape permanently. But first, they needed to deal with Robert. The police investigation was progressing, but slowly. Marcus had confirmed traces of kerosene in the burning pattern on the ladder, enough to warrant further investigation. James had interviewed neighbors and was building a domestic violence case. But Robert was clever. He hadn't left any obvious evidence. It was Emily who provided the final piece of the puzzle. During one of her visits, she casually mentioned that her father always recorded everything on his phone. He was obsessed with documenting his life, his achievements. Emily said that she had once seen a video on his phone that had frightened her, but when she asked about it, Robert became furious and forbade her from touching his things again. Sarah passed this information on to James. With this clue, and with the circumstantial evidence they had gathered, James obtained a search warrant. What they found on Robert Chen's phone and computer was beyond anyone's expectations. Not only evidence of arson planning, but years of documented abuse. Robert had recorded his assaults on Linda, apparently as a form of control and intimidation. The arrest happened a week after the fire. Sarah was there when James handcuffed Robert. The man shouted his innocence, claimed persecution, but his eyes, when he looked at Sarah, were cold and calculating. He knew he had been defeated, but Sarah could also see that he wasn't sorry, just furious at having been caught. Linda and Emily were discharged from the hospital the same day. Sarah helped them move into a safe shelter for victims of domestic violence, a place Robert could never find. She also connected them with lawyers, therapists, and support groups. Sarah used every contact she had accumulated over the years to ensure that mother and daughter had all the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. Robert Chen's trial was swift. With overwhelming evidence against him, including his own recordings, he accepted a plea deal: 15 years for arson and 10 more for multiple assault charges. That would be enough time for Linda to establish a new life, for Emily to grow up in safety. Sarah was in court on sentencing day. She watched Robert being led away and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But more importantly, she saw Linda hold Emily close, tears of relief streaming down her face. For the first time since Sarah had known them, mother and daughter seemed truly at peace. Months later, Sarah received a letter. It was from Emily, written in her childish handwriting but much more confident than that desperate note in the locker. Emily wrote about her new school, about how she was making friends, about the dog she and her mother had adopted. She wrote about being in therapy and how it was helping her process everything that had happened. But mostly, she thanked Sarah for believing in her, for not ignoring her cry for help. Sarah kept that letter in her locker at the fire station. On difficult days, when she questioned whether she was making a difference, she would read it. It reminded her that sometimes, saving lives wasn't just about rushing into burning buildings. Sometimes, it was about paying attention to the silent signs, the hidden cries for help. She thought about her own childhood, about the times she had wished someone would notice, that someone would do something. Her mother had eventually found the courage to leave, but it had taken years of suffering to get there. Sarah had chosen to become a firefighter, in part because of that deep need to protect, to save, to be the person she wished had appeared when she was a child. Emily had reminded her why she did what she did. It wasn't just about putting out fires or rescuing people from rubble. It was about being there when people needed her most, about being the difference between hope and despair. Sarah continued her work in the fire department, but with a renewed perspective. She began giving talks in schools about safety, but also about what to do if you or someone you know is in danger. She volunteered at shelters for victims of domestic violence, using her first aid skills and personal experience to help other families find their way to safety. She also kept in touch with Linda and Emily. They met for lunch once a month, sharing stories and building a friendship that transcended the traumatic circumstances of their first encounter. Sarah watched Emily blossom, transforming from a frightened child into a confident and vocal young woman about issues of child safety and well-being. Years later, when Emily was 15, she wrote a school essay about heroes. She didn't write about comic book superheroes or famous celebrities. She wrote about a firefighter who had heeded a silent cry for help, who had believed a child when it might have been easier to ignore her, who had risked everything to ensure a family could have a second chance. Sarah read that essay and wept. They weren't tears of sadness, but of profound gratitude. She had made a difference. She had been the person a child needed in their darkest moment. And in doing so, she had also healed some of her own childhood wounds. Sarah and Emily's story became known in the community, not because they sought publicity, but because their actions inspired others to pay attention, to believe children, and not to ignore the signs of abuse. Sarah was recognized not only as a courageous firefighter, but as an advocate for victims of domestic violence. She never considered herself a hero. For Sarah, She had simply done what any decent person should do. She had listened when someone asked for help. She had acted when she saw injustice. She had persevered when it might have been easier to walk away. But for Emily, for Linda, and for countless others who heard her story, Sarah Mitchell was exactly that. A hero who proved that sometimes a small act of thoughtfulness and courage can change not just one life, but entire generations. Linda Chen landed a job as an administrative assistant at a veterinary clinic, ironically the same field Emily had dreamed of pursuing. It was a modest, fresh start, but it meant financial independence for the first time in over a decade. Sarah helped her find a small but cozy apartment in a safe neighborhood, far from anywhere Robert might associate with them. The nights were the hardest for Linda. Even knowing that Robert was locked behind bars, she would wake up startled by nightmares, imagining hearing him knocking at the door. Therapy helped, but healing was a slow and non-linear process. There were days when Linda felt strong and confident, and others when the weight of everything she had endured left her paralyzed with fear and shame. Emily also struggled in her own way. At school, she had difficulty trusting adults, always expecting that the friendly facade hid something more sinister. Her teachers noticed that she would flinch when someone raised their voice, even if it wasn't directed at her. Nightmares would wake her in the middle of the night, reliving the smell of smoke, the heat of the flames, the terror of being trapped in that closet. But there was progress too. Emily started attending a support group for children who had experienced trauma. There, she met other children who understood what it was like to live in constant fear, who knew what it was like to have to hide the truth from the outside world. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her experience. Sarah visited regularly, always bringing small gifts or simply her comforting presence. She taught Emily about resilience not through grand words, but through her own example. She shared stories from her own childhood, about how she and her mother had rebuilt their lives after escaping her abusive father. One day, almost a year after the fire, Emily asked Sarah about forgiveness. She was confused about the conflicting feelings she had toward her father. Part of her hated him for everything he had done, but another part, the part that remembered the rare good moments, felt guilty for her role in putting him in prison. Sarah sat with Emily for hours that afternoon, helping her process these complex feelings. She explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing someone's actions. It meant freeing oneself from the weight of hatred, choosing not to let anger consume one's life. But she also made it clear that Emily owed her father nothing, that her only responsibility was to herself and her own healing. Linda was also learning this lesson. She had spent years blaming herself for the violence, believing that if she were only a better wife, more obedient, more caring, Robert would change. Therapy was helping her understand that the abuse was never her fault, that nothing she did or didn't do justified the treatment she received. Sarah watched mother and daughter grow stronger each month. Linda began to smile more easily, her shoulders no longer permanently tense. Emily made her first close friend at her new school, a girl named Sophie, who invited her to sleepovers and included her in her group. The second anniversary of the fire arrived quietly. Sarah suggested they do something to mark the occasion, not as a celebration of the tragedy, but as an acknowledgement of how far they had come. They decided to plant a tree together in a local park, a cherry tree that would bloom each spring as a symbol of renewal and hope. As they dug the hole and placed the young tree in the ground, Linda spoke for the first time about gratitude. She was grateful that Sarah had found Emily that night, that she had believed a frightened child, that she had persisted when she could have simply moved on. She was grateful for the fire, in a strange way, because it had finally freed them from a life of terror. Emily added her own soil around the tree's roots, her small but steady hands. She looked at Sarah and said something that made the firefighter's heart clench. Emily said that when she grew up, she wanted to help other children like Sarah had helped her. Maybe not as a firefighter, but in some way, that would make a difference. Sarah embraced them both, mother and daughter, there under the clear blue sky of that autumn afternoon. She thought of all the calls she had answered over the years, all the lives she had touched. But this one had changed something fundamental within her as well. Emily and Linda had reminded her of the power of simply paying attention, of not turning away from the suffering of others. In the following months, Sarah began working with local legislators to improve emergency response protocols involving potential domestic abuse. She argued that firefighters and paramedics were often the first responders in domestic situations and should receive additional training to recognize signs of family violence. Her proposal was initially met with skepticism. Some argued that it wasn't the firefighters' responsibility to get involved in family matters. But Sarah was persistent, sharing Emily's story without revealing identities, explaining how a moment of attentiveness had saved 2 lives. Eventually, she was able to implement a pilot program. Firefighters at her station began receiving training on the signs of domestic abuse, how to interact with trauma victims, and resources available in the community. The program expanded to other stations, then to other cities. Emily, now 16, decided to volunteer at a shelter for women and children who were victims of violence. She worked mainly with younger children, reading them stories, playing games, and being a calm and comforting presence. The children naturally gravitated towards her, instinctively sensing that she understood their fear in a way that many adults couldn't. Linda became an advocate for other survivors, sharing her story in support groups, offering hope to women who were still trapped in abusive relationships. She spoke about how it was possible to start over, how life on the other side of abuse, while challenging, was infinitely better than living in constant terror. Sarah watched all of this with quiet pride. She never sought recognition for her role in their journeys. For her, the true reward was seeing Emily and Linda not only survive, but thrive. It was seeing Emily laugh without reservation, Linda sleep without nightmares, both building futures that seemed impossible on that terrible night of fire and smoke. On a particularly cold winter night, 4 years after the fire, Sarah received a call. It was Linda, her voice full of emotion. Emily had been accepted into a prestigious university with a full scholarship to study social work. She wanted to dedicate her career to helping families in crisis, to being a voice for children who couldn't speak for themselves. Sarah hung up the phone with tears in her eyes. She looked around her small house, at the photos on the walls of all the people whose lives she had touched over the years. But that letter from Emily, still kept in a simple frame on her bedside table, remained the most precious. She thought of the frightened girl in the closet, holding out that piece of paper with trembling hands. She thought of how many other children were out there at that very moment, silently crying out for help that might never come. She thought of her own mother, who had finally found peace after years of struggle. Sarah's journey as a firefighter had taught her that courage took many forms. Sometimes it was running into a burning building, but sometimes it was simply stopping, paying attention, and choosing to act when it would have been easier to look the other way. It was believing in a child when the world might doubt. It was persisting when systems failed. Emily hadn't just asked for help. That night, she had offered Sarah a chance at redemption, an opportunity to be for another child what Sarah wished someone had been for her. And by accepting that piece of paper, by choosing to believe and act, Sarah hadn't just saved 2 lives. She had found a deeper purpose in her own work. Years of experience putting out fires had prepared Sarah for that particular moment. But it was her own experience with trauma, her empathy born of personal pain, that enabled her to truly see what Emily was trying to communicate. It was this combination of professional skill and human understanding that made all the difference. The story of a little girl making a silent plea for help and a firefighter who chose to respond became more than just a moment of heroism. It became a catalyst for systemic change, an example of how individuals can make a difference when they choose to care. And for Sarah Mitchell, it became a constant reminder that sometimes the most important rescues don't involve fire hoses or specialized equipment. Sometimes all that's needed is a willing heart to listen and the courage to act for what is right, no matter the personal cost.